From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. New York City Mayor Eric Adams indicted on federal fraud and bribery charges, but he vows to fight them and to stay in office despite calls for his resignation. We'll have more of this hour with New York political strategist Chapin Fay and discuss the potential implications for this election cycle with our political panel. Plus, we'll be joined by Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuania's foreign minister, for more on the war in Ukraine as President Zelenskyy sits down with both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at the White House today. And here with me for the hour for these conversations here on Bloomberg is our very own Michael Shepard. Great to have you, Mike, and what a day for it as we have a lot of news both in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy and city policy, frankly, in New York.
It really is quite a day, Kaylee. And the Adams news really has ripple effects far beyond New York City, and we're going to dive more deeply into that. It could have a spillover effect into congressional races. And then when it comes to Ukraine, Kamala Harris, who's seeking the presidency and for election in November, had some pointed words aimed at her opponent on the issue of Ukraine during her appearance with Zelenskyy this hour.
Yeah, and we're going to have more on that in just a moment. But we begin this evening with the indictment of Eric Adams. He will be arraigned at noon tomorrow in New York. And in a press conference earlier today, he said he has no intention to step down and is looking forward to defending himself.
It's an unfortunate day, and it's a painful day. But inside of all of that, it's a day where we will finally reveal why for 10 months I have gone through this. And I look forward to defending myself and defending the people of this city as I've done throughout my entire professional career.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg Government's Angela Greiling Keane, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Angela, obviously this has raises serious questions about the political future of Eric Adams himself, but it also raises questions about how he could impact the political future of others, as there is a number of hotly contested races in and around New York City for the House this election cycle.
You're right. This really has national impact. We're just a few weeks out from the election, and the balance of the U.S. House hangs in this moment, potentially. There are more competitive House races in New York than there are in any other state. And the Democrats in those races were scrambling last night, beginning, and then throughout today to, in some cases, distance themselves from Mayor Adams in this moment. We saw 4 candidates in tough races for Democrats calling for his resignation today. We're waiting to see if there's more. One person who hasn't, interestingly, not a tight race, but House Speaker, Minority Leader, exactly, wants to be House Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, did not call for Mayor Adams' resignation.
How long do we think it will be for us to hear from Jeffries? What is the connection between the two men? And is this something he's holding off on for any particular reason? Because we did see a number of House progressives, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, call for Adams to step down.
Right. AOC spoke out last night, even before the details of the charges were announced today. Why is Hakeem Jeffries holding out? I don't know for sure, but he may have more ammunition if he waits. But he definitely cares about becoming Speaker. He wants to win the House, and that path is really largely through New York, which he knows better than anybody else.
So we're going to be watching tomorrow as Eric Adams is arraigned. We'll see how the story develops, obviously. Something else that's happening tomorrow we wanted to talk to you about, Angela, is Kamala Harris making a trip to Arizona and going specifically to the border, an issue that she is frequently attacked on when it comes to her opponent, Donald Trump. It seems she's leaning in to weakness here.
Absolutely. She is heading to the southern border tomorrow. She is taking what is potentially a weakness for her and trying to own that. Arizona is one of the closest places in the country in terms of presidential polling right now, really, really deadlocked. Obviously, Democrats want to take Arizona. They need to take the competitive states if she is going to win. There's also a competitive Senate race in Arizona, so we could hear her talk about that. Democrats have a real tough path to hold on to the Senate, but of course they want to try.
All right, Bloomberg Government's Angela Greiling. Keane, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy visited the White House today to meet separately with President Biden and Vice President Harris. Harris making veiled references to her opponent while speaking alongside Zelenskiy last hour.
There are some in my country who would instead force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory, who would demand that Ukraine accept neutrality and would require Ukraine to forego security relationships with other nations.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who is in New York. Of course, the UN and General Assembly wrapping up there this week. And along this UN visit, we've heard comments coming from President Zelenskyy about both President Trump and vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance. It seems to be causing somewhat of a political firestorm here in Washington. You have members of the House now weighing in on this as well, Nick. What does this likely do to the chances of Ukraine continuing to get support when we're no longer talking about it being a Biden administration? What if it's a Trump one?
That is the question we're all trying to answer. I mean, clearly what happened was this trip was a bit of a disaster for Volodymyr Zelenskiy, some of it of his own making and some of it not. I mean, he did an interview with The New Yorker where he essentially said J.D. Vance was too radical and scolded him a little bit. So that obviously was not going to set him on good footing with President Trump. And then he went and visited this ammunition plant that was not only in the U.S., it was in Pennsylvania, sort of the swingiest of swing states, and it was even in Scranton, the birthplace of our current president. He was accompanied by Josh Shapiro, and so Republicans really went after this as what they said was a blatant partisan play, where he was essentially throwing his lot in with Kamala Harris. Of course, Zelenskyy denies that. He said his team was essentially unaware of the political element, but he's going back to Ukraine, really licking his wounds a little bit. He had tried to navigate these relationships and had actually done so relatively skillfully after the whole impeachment saga under the Trump presidency. But I think what you're going to really see here is a degree of animosity, not only from President Trump, but also from those hardline Republicans in the House who have the potential to really tie up funding if there is a request for more aid for Ukraine.
Nick, I wanted to come to you with a question about what Ukraine is going to get out of this trip. In terms of its request for, it's received $8 billion unveiled by Biden today. But in terms of other things it wants, Zelenskyy was hoping to present a victory plan to the administration. How is that landing? And on top of that, where do we think the rest of the Ukraine aid is going to, will it be allocated in time for the administration? Time in office runs out?
Well, that's what Joe Biden's trying to do. He essentially announced that he was going to drain what's left in U.S. coffers from the previous supplemental to go to Ukraine, and they're going to try to get that out of the door as quickly as possible. He's announcing he announced a new Patriot missile battery for Ukraine, all sorts of new munitions. So they really want to get that money out before January, and it's just essentially going to be a race against time to be able to fund Ukraine, given that it's so unlikely, frankly, that they would be able to approve a new supplemental, regardless of who wins. If Republicans retain control of the House, it would be very, very difficult to do. So this is something that Biden wants to do now, and he's just really hoping that they can get this. I mean, it should be noted, though, that that is quite a boon for Volodymyr Zelenskiy, though on the other hand, he's not getting some of the other stuff he wants, the long-range fires from the U.S., and also really a tepid reaction to the idea of this victory plan that he presented this week.
So that's Ukraine's victory plan. I'd also like to ask you, Nick, about the U.S. and other allies' ceasefire plan that was presented to Israel, looking for a pause in the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah on the northern border with Lebanon. Israel's foreign minister today saying there will be no ceasefire. Is this a flat-out rejection? Where does this go from here?
Well, I mean, again, great question, because what we essentially had happen was this extraordinary moment last night where the U.S. and its allies presented this 21-day plan. They said it's really up to both sides, and the signaling we were getting from the administration was that Israel was in conversation with the U.S. and was willing to go along with this idea. Of course, then you had the Israeli foreign minister coming out and saying no. Then you had the symbolism of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office releasing a photograph of him ordering an assassination, essentially, of a Hezbollah leader from the plane to the U.S. and then landing and saying they're going to continue and go full force against Hezbollah. So the U.S. is still saying Israel is in conversations with the U.S. and the ceasefire idea could go ahead. Israel very much, though, suggesting that it's not at all willing to do this, at least anytime soon.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much. Now, still ahead, we'll look at the potential fallout from Eric Adams' indictment on criminal charges with political strategist Chapin Fay. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Today we are announcing campaign finance, bribery, and conspiracy charges against Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. As the indictment alleges, Mayor Adams engaged in a long-running conspiracy in which he solicited and knowingly accepted illegal campaign contributions from foreign donors and corporations.
That was U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Damian Williams, at his news conference this morning, announcing a series of bribery and fraud charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. The first time in history a sitting New York City mayor has been indicted on federal charges. So let's bring in now an expert in New York politics. Chapin Fay, Republican strategist and founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, is with us. He's former spokesperson for former New York Governor George Pataki. Chapin, welcome. Always great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Eric Adams is maintaining his innocence. He says he looks forward to defending himself and intends to stay in the job as mayor and serve the people of New York. How long, realistically, do you think he'll be able to keep that up?
Well, that's the big question, right? You know, in America, we have the presumption of innocence before being proven guilty, but there is no due process in the court of public opinion. He's in real trouble. This is, you know, when the U.S. government and the U.S. attorneys bring an action, they usually have it locked up. They care about their win-loss rate very much. So I think he is in a lot of jeopardy. He has an election year coming up next year, so I suspect he's going to try and hold on as long as he can throughout that process. So is he going to? I think there's going to be a little bit of a grace period as some of the political folks take a look at, you know, how bad the indictment is and whether he really has a chance to prove his innocence. But you're now reading that, you know, the city controller just is calling him to step down. The governor has acknowledged that she's looking into her authority to remove him, and that's happening fairly quickly, you know, more quickly than usual. And I think his real problem, I call it the Governor Cuomo problem. New York City is already out of control because of mismanagement. How is he going to be able to govern a somewhat ungovernable city while he's fighting these federal charges? One of the things that got Governor Cuomo was that he just had too many fronts, right? He couldn't do his day job of running the state. And, you know, Eric Adams is really going to fail New Yorkers moving forward if he's got to deal with defending himself against this case and also, you know, governing the city and managing the city.
Chapin, what do you think might be happening behind the scenes? Sort of in the same way as we saw at the White House when Joe Biden, after his disastrous debate performance, had to decide whether or not to stay in the race, and ultimately he decided to drop out. What do you think is happening in the Adams camp right now as they size up this challenge of running a very big and, as you say, almost ungovernable city as he is facing criminal charges?
Well, everyone is in crisis mode, right? You know, I do crisis communications for a living, too, and the instinct is to, you know, the employee's instinct and people in City Hall's instinct is to dive under the desk and hope that the hurricane passes, which it never does. You've seen resignations over the past couple of days and weeks. You've seen other indictments. You've seen other investigations being launched. It's a huge mess inside City Hall, which is one of the reasons this is going to become unmanageable and spiral out of control. You know, he just had a cabinet member have to resign because he's under federal investigation. So I think you're going to see some, you know, rats jump from a sinking ship. And you're also going to see the proactive, the mayor had a press conference today with his supporters and allies surrounding him. He's working a surrogate program. He's going to have his surrogates out there talking to the media, defending him, talking about presumed innocent until proven guilty, and supporting, his record and his life of service. Yeah. However, his record, as a Republican consultant, I will tell you, is not that great. The city is a little bit running out of control compared to some of his predecessors.
Well, and Chapin, of course, at the end of the day, this isn't just about Eric Adams. It's about the impact that could ripple around not just New York City, but some of the counties surrounding it. Think Westchester or Long Island, areas in which there are competitive House districts in play this cycle. Speaking as a Republican, Chapin, what does this do to the odds of Republicans being able to keep hold of those seats in some of these areas and districts Biden won in 2020?
Well, when you try and tag a politician that is not necessarily related or affiliated with another one, it's sort of a bank shot in politics, but it will certainly be used as a cudgel, and particularly in some of these close races. You're going to start seeing, if we haven't already today, some of these candidates in tough races the Democrats start distancing themselves from the mayor, just to nip that in the bud. If I was advising them, I would say, call on him to resign and move on, right? We don't want to be talking about Democrat corruption in New York. And I would add, this is really a result of one-party rule, right? This is what happens when you have one-party rule. Almost the entire city, from local to federal, is controlled by Democrats, and there's no check on the power. There's no, Alvin Bragg is a progressive DA. You notice that he didn't announce any investigations of the mayor, right? So I do think, this is because there isn't a check on the power, particularly in New York City, of a one-party rule Democrat city.
Speaking of check on power, how do you think the vetting process by the party ahead of the mayoral election allowed this to somehow go unnoticed? The indictment says this goes back almost a decade. So how did some of these sorts of activities and transactions somehow escape the net of a political party doing screening and vetting of its candidates?
Well, to your point, there have been rumors dogging the mayor from his borough presidency to when he was in the state senate. So this isn't all that shocking, particularly when it comes to the trips. There have always been rumors about that. But I would say that he needs to really distance himself, really make proactive moves. I think he needs to fire some people. I think he needs to proactively start to talk about his record to the extent there is one and the positive nature of it. He really needs a huge push right now. I have been saying this actually for a while, especially when the investigation started. He really needs to act like a mayor. He's right now acting like a defendant or a target of an investigation. He needs to show that the city of New York is being governed and he is in charge. That is one significant thing he needs to do. And I haven't seen him do that in his mayoralty. It seems like he sort of doesn't have a vision, right? Rudy had a vision. Bloomberg had a vision. De Blasio had a vision. All their cabinets, agency heads were tasked with executing that vision. I don't see it out of Mayor Adams. I feel like he's lurching from crisis to crisis, which is, this is the biggest one so far, and it's really going to get him beat because he doesn't really have a hard and fast plan. I mean, he did have the press conference, but he really needs to be out there looking like he's managing the city.
All right, Chapin Fay, live from New York this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now coming up, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm on AI, energy, and competition with China. Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde in conversation with the secretary. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Earlier today, Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde spoke with Jennifer Granholm, the U.S. Energy Secretary, about competition with China in terms of AI, energy, and more at the AI Plus Energy Summit here in Washington. Here's a piece of that conversation.
It's about national security, but it's also about competition, right? We want to lead the world in AI, and we are. And we want it to stay that way. And so we don't want to, we don't want to create constraints on that. However, we recognize that constrained AI could also be used in a very negative way. And so we want to channel that in the right direction.
Is China the key competition?
Of course.
And how do you think the US, from an energy infrastructure perspective, competes there?
Well, we have to be constantly vigilant, right? From an energy point of view, I mean, China has got they're adding a huge amount of clean power to the grid, but they're also adding a lot of fossil to the grid to account for their own economic growth. But we think, I mean, we just want to be able in the U.S. to make sure that we are secure from a national security point of view. We're secure from an economic point of view. We're leading from a competition point of view, and we're doing it in partnership with the private sector who are doing these. A lot of these, the hyperscalers that we know of, these are trusted entities, right? They're not wild, but obviously not all of this development is happening within the bounds of trusted entities. So we got to be vigilant. We have to be careful, and I'd be curious. This is why it's important to have conversations like this with folks who are in the industry to say, what would you do? How should we be thinking about regulation going forward? How can we channel this in a way that makes sure that we're protected as a human race from the bad uses of AI?
Do you feel that those private entities are willing to work together in the way that you have just articulated, that they do and will band together for orders, for example?
Okay, well, I'm not sure that they will. We've been putting this to them. Come on, order it up so that we can do this. But I do say that they are, in their own ways, trying to identify where that clean power is coming from. And a lot of them have expressed great interest in these small modular reactors, which is great. A lot of them have expressed interest in long duration energy storage. So putting, 10-hour batteries with solar or wind. That's great. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of enhanced geothermal myself, and I love that there is experimentation and partnership happening in that space, but it is more expensive. All of these technologies are more expensive than what you find on the grid right now.
You can find the full conversation with Secretary Granholm online or on the terminal. And of course, you can frequently find Mike Shepard focusing on these AI questions here in our bureau in Washington. What do you make of the conversation with the Secretary?
Well, you can see the urgency that they're treating this whole question of AI and the energy demands that are associated with it. The data centers that the industry needs to build and wants to build to be able to maintain this edge in terms of geopolitical competition are just enormous. And we heard Sam Altman earlier this week. Yeah. We broke the news that he is calling for these mega power plants that would support energy needed for these data centers.
All right, coming up, we're going to talk about the ongoing war in Ukraine as President Trump just told reporters in New York he will be meeting with President Volodymyr Zelenskiy tomorrow. We'll have more ahead with the Foreign Minister of Lithuania next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Donald Trump just told reporters that he will be meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy tomorrow in New York. This is, of course, after Zelensky met with President Biden and Vice President Harris at the White House earlier today. So now let's go to the White House, where we find Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has the details. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. President Biden met earlier today with Ukrainian President Zelensky after announcing a new nearly $8 billion military assistance package for the country. This is part of a broader bid by President Biden to reassure his Ukrainian counterpart of continued ally support. Earlier, Zelensky thanked him for that commitment and then went on to say that Ukraine is working hard towards its goal of NATO membership.
We have a strong security agreement with the United States, and we are grateful for it, and we will fully implement it. And it's very important that we share the same vision for Ukraine's security future in the EU and NATO, and Ukraine is doing the unprecedented number of reforms on this path.
The new military aid package allocates about $5.5 billion for weapons from existing stockpiles. $2.4 billion is for what's known as the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a Pentagon fund to buy new weapons from U.S. companies. The White House says the shipments will include air defense systems, drones, and munitions. Biden also approved a new long-range weapon and an additional Patriot battery. But there was no mention of Ukraine's request to launch U.S.-made missiles deeper into Russia, which would essentially reverse a current U.S. policy. I actually had the chance to catch up with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he told me that he is urging the White House to grant that authorization.
This administration must enable Ukraine to strike targets deep within Russia as a matter of self-defense. The missile launch sites, the air bases have to be fair game for Ukraine.
Since Russia's invasion, the Pentagon has poured nearly $5 billion into U.S. factories to boost munition production, like 155mm shells, with an output goal of 100,000 per month by next year. It's part of a broader plan to revitalize the U.S. defense industrial base. Zelensky started his U.S. tour by visiting one of those factories in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but it sparked some controversy after Republicans pointed to Harris surrogate and Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro leading the battleground state visit, and Zelensky's recent comments criticizing vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance's opposition to additional aid. It's all complicating long-term prospects for more U.S. assistance to the country. As you mentioned, former President Trump originally declined an offer by President Zelensky to meet while he's in the U.S. He's now telling reporters that he will meet with him tomorrow. It comes after Zelensky met with Ukrainian President met with Vice President Kamala Harris just within the hour, and he also traveled to Capitol Hill and had a bipartisan meeting with lawmakers there. Kaylee.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall at the White House. Thank you. Of course, as we look forward to that Trump-Zelensky meeting that he says will happen in New York tomorrow, still, of course, awaiting a confirmation from the Ukrainian president on that. Let's talk more about the politics of it all. In the earlier edition of Balance of Power, I spoke with Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, and here's what he had to say about the political implications of Zelensky's visit to Pennsylvania.
That stop in Pennsylvania was highly political in the middle of a presidential election. You know, the Democrats would lecture us about foreign influence in our elections. Well, what is more, what demonstrates foreign influence any more than the leader of a foreign nation touring a facility in a battleground state 40 days before a presidential election? This is outrageous.
Joining us now for more is Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuania's Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is here in Washington after spending time in New York at the United Nations General Assembly this week. Minister, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. If I could first ask you if you think it is important Zelensky sits down with Donald Trump, who could very well be president of the United States again come January. Do you see a need to do some damage control here to not risk U.S. support of Ukraine in the future?
I think it is important. Definitely. And what we've seen in the past that Ukrainian government and president, they tried to offer as much transparency and information to the both sides of the aisle. They understand that the decisions have to be bipartisan if Ukraine wants to win this war. And they've proven in the past that they can do that. They understand the subtleties of U.S. politics. And they've been quite okay in this. Of course, now it's an election time. It's understandable that everything is extremely sensitive, and I'm sure that the meeting between him and President Trump will be extremely useful.
To follow up on that, Minister Landsbergis, we have seen, and you could tell from the clips that we just played, how much this is entering the 2024 presidential race right now. And we saw Vice President Harris even making a not-so-veiled criticism of Trump's own version of what he thinks peace in the region should look like. As somebody whose country sits on the doorstep of Russia, how do you view this political back and forth here in the U.S.? Does it undermine your confidence at all?
Look, I believe it was inevitable. We're having probably the biggest conflict in European continent since the Second World War. In hyper-politicized world, it's impossible not to talk about this. It's impossible not to form opinions about this. So really, I mean, at least in Europe, nobody believed that this will be left out of the debate. So people are concerned, obviously, of how, what this debate will lead to. But I don't think that anybody is surprised that it's happening. Now, when it comes to the content of the debate, the substance of it, Look, I think that it's impossible it would be very difficult to admit that either side would like to see Ukraine losing. That means that in one form or the other, whoever wins this election, I believe that they will be committed to Ukraine winning. And that means that they will need to form a policy that will lead to that. And I think that what Ukrainian president is now doing, offering a victory plan, I think, again, it's very useful to understand how Ukrainians are thinking, what do they need, and then, to formulate a position on it.
Well, and we know that victory plan was shared with President Biden in this meeting at the White House. I wonder to what extent, if you've seen it, it is based on this notion that Ukraine be freed up to use longer-range missiles to go on offense against Russia in more of its territory. Is that something you would push this administration to change its course on?
There are a couple of elements in the plan, as far as we know. It is first being presented here in Washington, then it will be presented in detail to other countries, and it's quite understandable. But the basics of it is, first of all, Ukraine has to be equipped. It has to be equipped in order to be in the strongest position to defend its own country. And not every time we were convinced that this is happening. And therefore, current announcement of almost $8 billion of new equipment, especially ammunition, is incredibly important. The second thing, ammunition needs to be used. If you provide it, but you don't allow to use it, well, it's not as helpful as it can be.
So you do think the Biden administration needs to be more liberal in the ways in which it allows this to
I think, yes, definitely. I mean, in order for Ukraine to push Russia, to a corner where they would be, able to shift the dynamics of the battlefield, they have to be able to target logistical sites, launch sites, rocket missile launching sites, and other areas from which Russia is attacking or supplying the front line. So it's incredibly important. And third thing, what we heard also President Zelensky saying, is security guarantees. If we want to see Ukraine in the future rebuilt with people who are returning and, full-fledged part of the Western world, we have to guarantee their security so that 2014 scenario is not repeated once more, because they were not given security guarantees in 2014 and we have the war in 2022. Now we cannot repeat the same mistake again. Therefore, I fully support President Zelensky's request to really commit to their security. And, there's no other security guarantee that Europe believes more than Article 5 of Washington Treaty.
Mm-hmm. And on that subject, Ukraine would very much like to be part of NATO, but do we think all NATO members who would have to approve this unanimously, would they go along? And I'm thinking of Hungary. Would they necessarily fall in line and back this?
I don't think that it's an easy process. It never is. I wouldn't expect that. But at this stage, we have to ask ourselves and our partners very important questions. If Ukraine is not secure, then can we say that NATO is secure? If Putin is not stopped right now, are we sure that he will not continue? And if we cannot answer these questions with certainty that Putin will not continue, Ukraine will stay safe outside NATO, and I believe that we can't, that means that we have to do something about it, and that something is actually extending Article 5 to Ukraine. So, to get deep into the arguments. And I really like that this question is put out there. So it's not taboo that, that Ukrainians are talking about this, that, other countries are talking about this. So it's out there. We really have to address this.
All right, Minister, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. We should note he's spending time with us before heading to receive the Transatlantic Leadership Award for 2024 here in Washington, D.C. tonight. Congratulations to you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you back here on Bloomberg soon. That's Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Foreign Minister of Lithuania. Now coming up, we'll take a look back at the fallout from the federal indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Our political panel joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
we have a city right now that is in peril. And I think that this is a major distraction for the mayor. I think the mayor needs to focus on these serious charges. You have to remember that there are multiple people within his cabinet that have resigned. So I think this is really the tip of the iceberg. But it has made this city really failing. It's failing. And people are suffering as a result.
Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York talking about the indictment of New York City's Mayor Eric Adams on the earlier edition of Balance of Power today. Now joining us for more on the late edition is this evening's political panel here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Lester Munson, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group and Republican strategist, and Christy Setzer, president and founder of New Heights Communications and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. The Democrat has to field this one first. As a Democrat, is it the responsible thing for him to do to resign? And if he doesn't, is it the responsible thing for Kathy Hochul, the governor, to do to force him out?
It is the responsible thing for him to resign, and this will maybe surprise you that I feel this way as he's a fellow Democrat, but I do think this is something where Democrats in general, we actually like to get the corrupt people out of our party. We do not like to stand up for them. See also Senator Bob Menendez. So I agree. We are 40 days out from the election. We don't need this. He should resign.
How do you see this process unfolding, Christy? If it were to Eric Adams, he would stay in office. But for the rest of the party, including many progressives, they would like to see him go. If he's holding on, somebody has to make the first move. So who is that?
Well, I mean, I think it would probably, I think there will be a series of calls for him to resign, as there already have been, right? I think he's going to have to try. He's going to try to hold on. As he said, he's not going to resign. He's going to make him, he's going to make this ugly. So at some point, it's going to have to be the case where the calls are just so intense and so universal that he has no other path forward.
Well, it's not a clear call yet from Hakeem Jeffries, who, of course, represents a district in New York City and is the Democratic leader in the House. He just says that he's entitled to the presumption of innocence and that he's praying for the well-being of our great city. So, Lester, keeping in mind that Hakeem Jeffries would like to be Speaker of the House, not just Democratic leader of the House, how should we be considering what this controversy and indictment surrounding Mayor Adams does to the Republican chances of holding on to some of these districts that could make or break the majority?
Well, it's an interesting dilemma for New York Republicans. New York Republicans have been trying to divorce themselves from the Trump campaign and say, national politics don't matter, I'm better for this district. Now it's going to be the Democrats who want to say, actually, this is all about the district. Don't worry about what's going on in New York City. Vote for the candidate, not the party. Because so really both, I think, maybe a level set here for Republicans in New York who are running for re-election. The two of them who are a little bit vulnerable. I think this strengthens them a little bit. Probably not enough to make a difference at the end of the day, but it's certainly going to put them on top for the day.
And where do you see them taking advantage if they were to do so? Is it a question of just being able to fundraise in the final weeks of the race? Is it a question of crafting new talking points around the Democratic Party and whatever opponent they might be facing?
I think there's an artful way to refer to both parties having some issues, and you really should look at the individual characteristics of the candidates, and they can kind of make a case for themselves and say, don't worry so much about party labels, because Trump's not going to do well in New York. And so Republicans there need to find a way to say it's about me, not about the party. This really helps them do that.
Well, as we mentioned Trump in New York, it is worth pointing out Donald Trump has been convicted of criminal charges in New York. This, of course, is just an indictment at this point for Mayor Adams. I actually asked about the parallels of Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, who is a surrogate for the Trump campaign, on the early edition of Balance of Power. And here's what he had to say about what he sees as the difference.
When it comes to Eric Adams in New York, and this is why I'm saying it's important that you cannot try to create some moral equivalency between these two situations. What Eric Adams apparently is facing is dealing with major campaign finance violations. Very different matter than the ridiculous indictments brought to us by Jack Smith, Merrick Garland, the ridiculous RICO charges down in Georgia that make no sense at all, and obviously what happened in Lower Manhattan.
Do you see a moral equivalency, Christy?
I mean, that was delicious. That was really sort of an amazing quote that he just gave there. I think that actually you could see it sort of playing out maybe in these last 40 days, and not necessarily in the way that you think. Like, I could actually see the Democrat running against Anthony Esposito, trying to tie them together on this. They are two corrupt men in blue, so you could actually see ads where people are both trying to distance them and not necessarily in the traditional ways.
Talk about the symbolism of unveiling these charges this week, of all weeks. We were talking before we came on about the New York City traffic. It's United Nations General Assembly week.
Right.
It's a marquee moment for the city. Doing it this week, tell me about that.
It is a distraction. This is one where usually there's not a lot of other news other than the UN General Assembly and Climate Week, and everyone is focused on that. You have a number of other big international city mayors who are here for this, in addition to international leaders. And it doesn't make us look great, right? That this is one of our biggest city mayors, and he is embroiled in such corruption, both domestic and, it seems, international.
Do you think there's anything to that timing, Lester?
I think there is something to that, and one of the things I think we should note that is waiting in the wings is Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, who very much wants to be mayor. So if Eric Adams either steps down or is pushed out by the governor, then we could see a return of the great Andrew Cuomo to public prominence in New York City. I'm not really sure that's what anyone wants.
Well, I think we'll have to stay tuned to see the outcome of that one, just like you all should stay tuned here, because coming up, we'll have more with the political panel on the presidential campaign trail with Kamala Harris going to the border tomorrow. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
We do have a broken immigration system, and it needs to be fixed. And if we take a step back, months ago, some of the most conservative members of the United States Congress came together with others, proposed a border security bill. That would have put 1,500 new border agents on the border. Donald Trump got word of the bill, realized it was going to fix a problem he wanted to run on, and told them to kill the bill, don't put it up for a vote. And my pledge is that when elected president, if the American people will have me, I will bring that bill back and I will sign it into law.
Vice President Kamala Harris last night during an interview on MSNBC where she was asked about the border, a place she'll be visiting tomorrow on a trip to the battleground state of Arizona. Back with us is our political panel for final thoughts, Lester Munson and Christy Setzer. So, Lester, obviously the border seen as one of Harris's biggest weaknesses. She's frequently attacked on that issue by her opponent, leaning into it by making a visit. What do you make of the timing?
Well, now's the time. People are voting. There's not much time left. She's got a fairly decent case on that bill that Trump killed. But really, the record isn't fantastic for her and the Biden administration. It does open her up to some pretty tough attacks from the Trump campaign. I think it's a gutsy and risky move to go to the border and try to ameliorate those attacks. But she's going to have to perform well. She's going to have to hit all the notes, maybe answer some questions and some of the tough questions. And then I think this could be a win for her in that it'll be less bad of an issue for her going forward.
Is this strong enough an issue now in 2024 as it was in 2016? In other words, will Donald Trump be able to exploit it to the same degree that he did 8 years ago?
I don't think so. I think the best issue for Trump remains the economy itself. That's the thing that people are going to be voting on. Immigration might be the second most important issue, but I think at the end of the day, the difference maker for whoever's going to win is going to be what they say about the economy.
Well, and we heard from Harris on the economy. She gave a speech on it in Pittsburgh yesterday, now to the border Friday. It's like weakness week for her, but trying to make them strengths, right, Christy?
Well, I wouldn't say the economy is a weakness for her, and it shouldn't be. And in fact, as you're looking at polling recently, she has almost evaporated Trump's lead on the economy. I would say that I disagree, frankly, with the strategy of her leaning in on the border. I think it was smart. I think she gave a smart answer in that conversation, in that interview. I think that it was smart of them earlier in her campaign when they rolled out endorsements from the border mayors and using surrogates, I think, to deliver that message, I think is a good idea. But ultimately, maybe this drives up Trump's negatives on the border in giving that answer, but she needs to be leaning into her base. She needs to be throwing a great party that everybody wants to join and not leaning in on things where she's weak.
All right. Christy Setzer and Lester Munson, our political panel today. Thank you so much for being with us. And thanks as well to Bloomberg's Michael Shepard for being with me for this hour. We'll, of course, see Harris at the border tomorrow, which will bring news. And we're going to see Eric Adams, who we were just speaking about, arraigned at noon tomorrow.
Right. Lots happening tomorrow, and can't wait to see what tomorrow will bring on all of those fronts.
Of course, we'll have full coverage of that, as always, in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal and online. Plus, of course, you can come back to Balance of Power for all of the latest news. We'll see you then on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.